PhD candidate at the University of Maryland, and I'm going to be presenting the culmination of several years of research that we've done on farm fields located on the Lower Eastern Shore. So I have a lot of collaborators listed here. I just want to mention everyone's names really quickly. Elizabeth de la Reguera and Kate Tully are at UMD. Karen Gadan and Man Key are at George Washington University. Becky Pension-Neal is with Resources for the Future in DC. And Jared, who's been organizing this meeting, he's at University of Delaware, and he took all of the drone imagery that I'll be showing you in this presentation today. And then just a little bit of background. So this is one of the sites that we work on during a high tide event in the spring in 2018, where this lawn on this house is pretty much underwater. So it's just emphasizing the effects that sea level rise and saltwater intrusion are having on this region. And I'm sure if you live here and you farm here, you've seen those effects on your property as well. Just listing my collaborators, my funding organizations. So saltwater intrusion, salt-affected soils are a global problem. They affect about 75 different countries and about 20% of arable land. So you can see where the majority of that is in the Middle East. However, we're experiencing saltwater intrusion here for a different reason because of sea level rise and that salt front moving in. So this is some drone footage that Jared took, and this is just to show you these sites that we study and how close they are to these tidal creeks that drain into the larger rivers and estuaries of the Chesapeake Bay, and then a little star to emphasize where that is on the eastern shore. So these are the sea level rise predictions for Somerset County and Dorchester County. So on the left, we have the coastal plain of North American coastal plain highlighted in green, and then the pink is areas that will be completely inundated under 3 feet of sea level rise, and that's projected to happen around 2100 according to emission scenarios. So you see I've zoomed in here on Somerset and Dorchester, and the red is open water, the white are the outlines of the counties, and all of the greener stuff is different land use categories. So in this area, it's mostly agriculture, wetlands, or forested areas. And then you can see current amount of open water, so 0 feet of sea level rise, 1 foot on the bottom panel, and that is projected to happen around 2050. So that's happening pretty soon in the next 30 years, and then 3 feet by 2100. And you can see how much of these counties are going to be completely inundated. So saltwater intrusion, sea level rise are a huge problem in this area, and they're only going to get worse. So just to list really quickly some of the drivers of saltwater intrusion: sea level rise, increasing frequency and intensity of storms and tides. So I'm sure if any of you have seen the king tide, you know what I'm talking about. And then storms, hurricanes are predicted to get more frequent and more intense in this region. Drought can exacerbate saltwater intrusion by decreasing freshwater flows to areas. So the salt front moves into those areas, the way that we manage our water on the land, and the hydrologic connectivity of everything. So in this region, a lot of our farm fields have very high hydrologic connectivity to these tidal creeks and these streams. Oftentimes these ditches are directly connected to these creeks. So when the tide comes in, the ditches fill up and some of that water gets onto the fields. What are some of the effects? So coastal forest loss. So these are some ghost forests you can see on the top panel. Species invasion of salt-tolerant plants, such as Phragmites australis. Yield declines, eutrophication, and marsh migration. So that's marshes moving upland. So I'll just show you the sites where we've been working for the past few years. So most of them are in Somerset County. We have a few in Dorchester. I don't have that farm listed on here, but they're all along these peninsulas that are sort of jutting into the bay. The average land elevation on these sites is only 2 feet, so very small changes in elevation can have huge consequences for saltwater intrusion. And sorry, that's kind of hard to read, but that's just the salinity range in the main stem portion of the bay for that area. And it ranges from 5 to 18 parts per thousand. That's the mesohaline range, and that's dependent on the season. So in the springtime, when there's more freshwater flow, it's closer to 5. During the driest time in October, it can get up to 18. So there's a pretty high variability in the salinity levels. And just to illustrate, too, there's very high spatial variability on these farms. So this is just zooming in on one of our farms. You can actually see the effects of saltwater intrusion on the farm. It's those sort of grayish areas on the edges of the fields. And we just came out and took point salinity measurements. These are in parts per thousand. And along this sort of marshy area bordering the farm, and even close to these fields, you can see it ranges anywhere from 1 to 9 parts per thousand, depending on where we sampled. And then that little arrow is with the 420 meters is for just kind of for scale. So you can see it's over a very short distance. So just pictures of what this actually looks like on these farms. On the left, this is a soy field with algae growing on it. So you can't see it in this picture, but there's a ditch on the side, and a lot of saline water has moved into the ditch and spilled onto the field. So it's like completely decimated the crops on that side of the field. And we measured salinity to be around 10 parts per thousand in the soil pore water. Same with this ghost forest bordering another ag field. It was around 10 parts per thousand. You can see the sort of where the salt front is, and the trees have started to die off. And then this is really incredible. The last picture it looks like it could be out west or something on a salt flat. So that was after a series of very dry, hot days where the salt water actually precipitated up through the soil and formed a crust on the top of the soil. So in the topsoil, we were able to measure salinity at about 30 parts per thousand. So it really concentrated the salts. And that's almost as saline as ocean water. So there's like various drivers for the way that salt moves through the soil and the way that it manifests itself on these fields. Just a few more pictures to illustrate this. This is a road that I'm normally able to drive down, but this was during the king tide in Somerset County in the spring of 2018. This is a field where we wanted to start planning some of our salt-tolerant crop trials, but clearly were unable to as the field was completely flooded, and we measured salinity to be about 6 parts per thousand, so much higher than any normal cash crop can germinate, and not to mention that they cannot germinate with this amount of flooding. And these are some plots where we wanted to plant our salt-tolerant crops. We're probably now going to be planting some wetland restoration species there because these plots just become so flooded that things just don't have a chance to germinate. So that's what it looks like on the field. Here's another aerial image where you can really see the effects of saltwater intrusion. It's pretty incredible. So one of our objectives was to actually quantify the acres of farmland that are going to be lost to saltwater intrusion in the coming years. So we had a postdoc who did a remote sensing analysis to determine how much land would actually be lost. And this is in Somerset County. So she used imagery from the National Agricultural Imagery Program, and she compared 2009 to 2017. This database is about 1 meter resolution, and this was sort of her methodology here. I'm not going to walk you through it too much, but if you're curious, you can ask me more later. And this is what she found. So these are, on this graph here, the x-axis is comparing these different categories of land use. So the AG is agricultural, FMAR stands for forested marshy areas, so they're forests that are converting to marshes, greener forests, and I can explain the other categories, but a thing I want you to note is that the largest proportion of land that was lost from 2009 to 2017 in Somerset County was ag land that was actually converted to marshland. And this ended up being about 25% of the total land that changed the land use category. And this was equivalent to 860 acres just within the last decade. So that's quite a bit. And then just keep in mind that this number will only be accelerating as saltwater intrusion accelerates, sea level rise accelerates. In the same time period, 500 acres of coastal forested land. And then just to know, all of these affected areas were pretty low elevation, so below 2 meters. And if you're curious about understanding more about like stepping out and looking more regionally and seeing how much farmland has been lost to saltwater intrusion, you can check out this study that came out of the Kirwan lab. Over the last 150 years, they predicted that about 2,000 acres of farmland have been converted to marsh. So the question is, what do we do about this problem? So one option is we can choose to try to protect this land, maybe by berming or building it up and continuing to grow conventional crops there. We can choose to adapt by trying alternative cropping systems, so some salt-tolerant crops, some things that will help the farmer get some value out of the land before it becomes completely converted to marsh. And then the last option is to restore, so to take advantage of conservation easement programs to turn this land into a wetland state. I'm not going to focus too much on protect for this talk for a couple reasons. One, that it seems to be probably the least economically viable option for these areas right now. But I am going to focus on adapt and restore. So we'll start with some of the ways that we've been looking at helping farmers adapt to this problem. So I'm going to present some of the work that a master's student in our lab has done, Elizabeth de la Reguera. She did a lot of work with looking at salt tolerance in salt-tolerant crop varieties. So there's a couple ways that plants can deal with excess salt in their environment. Let's see. So some plants that are not salt-tolerant are subject to either ionic stress or osmotic stress. So ionic stress is, she made this cool animation here. So normally when a seed takes up water, it's able to easily take it in. But when that water is laden with salt, it becomes harder. So this is osmotic stress. It becomes harder for that seed to take up the water due to the decreased water potential. And then another problem is that if the seed is able to take up the water, it then brings sodium and chloride into it, and those can be toxic to the plant. So that is ionic stress. So her objectives were to determine how osmotic and ionic stress affect seed germination in standard cropping systems and with these alternative crops, and to determine the germination success of alternative crops planted on these salt-intruded farm fields. So she started off with a controlled lab experiment just to control all the factors and see how well these different seed varieties could germinate under different conditions of negative water potential. So these are the standard crops she used: corn, soy, and wheat. The alternative crops were sorghum, a salt-tolerant soybean variety, and barley. She also tried quinoa, which isn't really an economically viable crop for this region, but we have the seeds, so she just figured that she would just look and see because it's a known halophyte, and just to see how it compared to the other ones. And these are the water potentials she looked at. So this is conductivity in millisiemens per centimeter. If you think in parts per thousand, you can just divide that number by 2. So these are the water potentials that she exposed the different seeds to, and then she looked at the germination rates. So I'll show you some of those results. So this is what she found with the conventional crops. So she found that none of these conventional crops germinated that well under the ionic stress. Some of them, wheat was able to germinate okay under osmotic stress, as was corn. And we probably need to rerun the soy because we didn't get the best germination rates just in general, even at 0 water potential. And then this is just comparing those to the salt-tolerant varieties. So you have sorghum here, the salt-tolerant soy and the barley. And they all seemed like they did okay with the osmotic stress. Oh, and I should specify that for osmotic stress, the way that we mimicked that was we used propylene glycol, which is like a sugar, so it created that negative water potential without the toxicity of sodium and chloride. And she did see, so she ended up seeing from this study, oh, this is just throwing that quinoa in there too. What she found was actually surprising. She didn't find a big difference between the standard and the alternative germination. But we know that farmers in this region have already begun to switch to growing sorghum on these affected fields. So we know that sorghum is much more salt tolerant than corn, soy, or wheat. So, so that's when she decided to look at field trials to compare those controlled laboratory experiments to what's actually happening on the field and just sort of have those two sets of results that we could look at on the whole. So this is some more drone imagery of one of the sites, and you can see the crop trials, those little strips. You can actually see where the fields are affected by salt. It's sort of those white areas. And these plots were, I think they were 10 by 20 meters. So we did a randomized complete block design, 4 replicates per treatment, and then our treatments were like a natural recruitment control, so that's just looking at how the weeds did in that area. A sorghum, salt-tolerant soybean, and barley rotation, which I'll show you a little diagram of in the next slide. Salt marsh hay, and switchgrass. And we also took soil solution on 2 ends of the plot to look at salinity, nutrient levels, and salinity and nutrient levels. And then she did germination counts in the field 1 month after they were planted. So this is a 5-year study we have funded from NIFA, so we're actually in year 2 right now. So this is just to show you what that rotation looks like in the field. Another cool image. So she looked at those the conductivity in those lysimeters to see if there was a difference on one side of the plots and the other side of the plots. And she looked at this at 2 farms, and she found that at the one farm in Dorchester County, there was a significant difference towards the, so I should say the 5 meters is the distance from the ditch that was bringing salt water into the field. So when you're a little bit closer to the source of the salt water, she saw a little bit higher conductivity in Dorchester farm, but in the Somerset farm, she actually did not find any difference. And then this line here is just to give you a reference. This is the mean tolerance limit for corn, wheat, and soy. So she plotted to see how, well, to see if the plants responded more to osmotic stress or ionic stress in the field. So she plotted these lines with 95% confidence intervals and saw like which data points fit better in one line or the other to sort of pick apart those effects. So with the sorghum, she saw that the decline in germination was actually explained by the ionic stress, which makes sense because the sorghum is naturally drought tolerant. And then with the salt tolerant soy, this is actually a cultivar that's bred to exclude chloride, so it should be pretty resistant to ionic stress as well. She found that it did not germinate well under the drought conditions, and it also didn't perform well under flooding events. So just to kind of like summarize these findings, basically what this is saying, combined with the lab study, is that choosing crops to grow on these salt-intruded farm fields is challenging because of the complexity of saltwater intrusion, the complexity of these flooding cycles and drought cycles that can also affect germination, and combined with the effect of salt stress on species. So, so it's good to just go with what works. And we have another 3 years of the study, so it'd be cool to compare those next 3 years to what she found, and maybe the weather will cooperate a little bit better and these seeds will have better germination. So conclusions from her study: farmers have already switched to planting sorghum on salt-intruded farm fields, which highlights the complexity of growing crops on these fields. The next part of this is to include yields of alternative crops. So these are just the germination counts. So when these are already harvested, when we get those yield data, it'll be interesting to look at the yields and see how they compare between the two types of crops. And then it would also be interesting to look into the potential of halophytic crops or restoration species as a means of ameliorating salt damage or promoting coastal wetland restoration. So I'll get into that a little bit more in the next slide. So this is the restore part of this talk. I'm going to be presenting some of the work by Karen Goodan, who's a wetland marsh ecologist and does a lot with like plant community succession. So what happens to fields when farming stops on them? What happens on these salt-affected fields? Karen Goodan here, so she's at George Washington University, looked at this on these same fields over the past 3 years, and she found that they exhibited an unusual mix of upland and wetland species. And you can see some of those in these pictures here. And this was results from a study she just published showing these different areas on the fields and surrounding the fields. So she has these marsh habitats for comparison. It's kind of a control. These abandoned fields, so these are fields that were used for, some of them were leased for solar and then they were never replanted. So the two in the middle, the saline edge and the saline interior, are different parts along these salt-affected fields. And she looked at this over, I believe it was 3 years, to see how the plant communities compared across these different habitats. So she found that the saline, with the saltwater intruded fields, they had more weeds than the marsh, but less than these abandoned fields. The wetland species, so interestingly and somewhat expected, they had as many as the marsh and more than these abandoned fields, showing that like if left alone, these fields will actually begin to sort of restore themselves on their own, to restore themselves to like a native marsh habitat. And the mix of other native and invasive species, she found that they had less than the marsh, but more than the abandoned fields. So they're sort of this intermediate mix of native marsh habitat and agricultural habitat, abandoned agricultural habitat. What would happen on a field that was left alone but did not experience saltwater intrusion? And this is just to show that again. So she found that they had, so this is comparing the second and the third year on these salt-affected fields, and she found that they had more native plants in the third year than the second year, more wetland species in the third year, so again you're seeing that plant community succession, and fewer weed species in the third year than the second year, suggesting that these fields are maybe almost like managing themselves to get back to this native state. So if left alone, maybe we don't have to do as much weed management on them. Maybe they will start to look more like native marsh habitat on their own. And then these are so these are biomass data from 3 different farms, 3 different salt-intruded farms. So it's the same fields that I showed you in the previous slides. And she just looked at how the biomass compared in these planting trials on these fields. So this was the data from the first year of the study that we've been conducting. So the salt marsh hay did pretty well. The switchgrass, I think, died in one of the plots, but did okay in the other 2. And then, interestingly, the weed biomass was lower, suggesting that planting some of these salt marsh species can also help control the weed population as well. And then I just wanted to get into a little bit more of the restoration work, and this is some other work that Elizabeth has been doing, where she was looking at carbon storage potential on these salt-intruded fields, and she looked at a transect from basically the part of the field that was growing healthy crops to the edge of the field where it was bordering the ditch. So this is sort of the transect she looked at. It's important to note that most of the farmers were still actively managing these parts of the field, so they were spraying herbicide and they were mowing the above ground biomass to try to control the marsh migration upland. So she divided into kind of these 5 different areas. And then her question was, what's happening to soil carbon storage along this transect? How is it changing? So this is what it looks like from some aerial imagery. This is sort of the transect that she took these different cores at. And transect was about 80 meters in length. And then this is just to show results from the carbon pools. She did a lot of study on soil aggregate sizes too. I'm not going to present that. I'm just going to talk about the carbon pools. So she found, maybe not surprisingly, that the ditch banks, which were closest to the ditches and closest to the marshes, exhibited a lot more total carbon storage in the top 50 centimeters compared to the other transect points. So the crop to field edge did not vary that much, but then once you got to those ditch banks, you saw a big bump in the carbon storage. And even though that above ground biomass was being mowed down and sometimes removed by the farmers, there's still so much below ground biomass, and these wetland plants tend to have really large biomass in their root systems. So that was contributing to the overall carbon storage in these areas. So just to go back to our little visual schematic to kind of help you visualize that along these transects. As you go from the crop edge to the ditch bank, this total carbon pool increases. And I just want to note that there are also some changes in the soil that are happening. So the soil is moving from a more aerobic agricultural soil to a more hydric wetland soil, and that changes a lot of the soil processes that are happening. And there's a lot of evidence that the repeated wetting and drying of soil in this area can help actually stabilize carbon. Higher salinity can create more poorly crystallized iron and aluminum in the soil, which is associated with a lot of soil organic matter. And then also vegetation in these areas can help to sequester more carbon. So this has pretty big implications for incentivizing management of these areas. If we know that these areas are turning into salt marsh habitat, which is a very valuable ecosystem, and that they are sequestering this much carbon, perhaps we should place more value on that in terms of conservation easement programs. Right now, the programs don't take into account this unique case of saltwater intrusion where all of these things are happening. And so I'm almost done, but I just wanted to make a note that the farmers that we've been working with for the past 4 years have just been incredibly helpful with helping us design these studies and carry out these experiments, because they're on the land every day, really understand, like seeing what's happening on their properties. Giving us that anecdotal information has been very helpful. So they've really been our partners in helping to understand coastal change and helping us figure out what kind of research do we need to do so that we can all adapt to this problem together. Yeah, and this is just to summarize basically what I just said. And I think that's it. Yep, and that's everything I have. I just want to thank all the labs that helped make this project possible. And if you want to contact me or have any questions, my contact info is up here, as well as Dr. Tully's and Elizabeth.